Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
I was going through my short list, deciding what I was going to do next, and I realized that the SS Andrea Doria was on there twice. And I'll just go ahead and say it's an Italian ship. The Italian pronunciation of it would be closer to Andrea Doria. I would say I've heard most English speakers say Andrea Doria. I'm not super worried about being fiddly with it in this episode. But I did figure it's there 2 different times on my short list, so why not go ahead and do that? And it's also possible that there will be another twice on the short list episode soon, because this was not the only topic I discovered I had written on there twice at some point. So my short list, it's long enough to have duplicates on it and me not realize.
Same.
So the SS Andrea Doria was a luxury cruise liner that sank after colliding with another ship called the Stockholm in 1956. This came up in our episode on the Empress of Ireland disaster. That episode came out in November of 2023 because these 2 collisions had several similarities. There was one particular moment in the research and writing process where I was like, I've described this exact collision previously. The Empress of Ireland disaster was the worst maritime disaster to happen in Canadian history, during a civilian peacetime situation. This collision was also tragic, but most of the people who were on the Andrea Doria were rescued before the ship sank, thanks to one of the biggest civilian maritime rescues in history.
This disaster took place as transatlantic travel was shifting from happening by sea to by air. The first flights across the Atlantic Ocean had taken place back in the 19-teens, but it wasn't until after World War II that airlines really started working on commercial passenger service, thanks in part to the aircraft and runways that now existed because of the war.
By the early 1950s, multiple carriers were making commercial flights across the Atlantic, but these flights were expensive and long. These were propeller-driven airplanes, and they typically had to make at least one refueling stop, somewhere like Gander on the northwest coast of the island of Newfoundland, or Shannon in Western Ireland, or they might need to stop both of those places. The first transatlantic jet flight didn't take place until 1958, 2 years after this disaster.
Even though most passengers were still crossing the Atlantic on ships, shipping lines recognized the air travel industry as a threat. Obviously, the idea of luxury ocean liners was not at all new, but there was an increasing focus on the idea that a trip across the ocean might be part of a vacation and not just a way of getting from one place to another.
This brings us to the SS Andrea Doria, flagship of the Italian line. This ship was part of the post-World War II efforts to rebuild Italy's naval fleet, and it was meant to provide a beautiful, comfortable, luxurious crossing of the Atlantic Ocean for celebrities, vacationers, business travelers, and immigrants alike. It could carry more than 1,200 passengers and 560 crew, with the passenger accommodations divided among first, cabin, and tourist class, with cabin and tourist essentially being second and third class, respectively. Each class had its own outdoor swimming pool, which each of these pools on a separate level of the deck at the stern of the ship, making kind of a little 3 terraces of swimming pools.
The Andrea Doria was described as a floating art gallery, full of original works of art and copies of works by Italian Renaissance artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Titian. In the first-class lounge, there was also a life-sized bronze statue of the ship's namesake, 16th-century Admiral Andrea Doria, ruler of the Genoese Republic. The mid-century modern decor was meant to be attractive and inviting, and of course, the ship was full of dining rooms, lounges, reading rooms, card rooms, and the like.
In terms of safety, the Andrea Doria had 11 watertight compartments, and it could stay afloat if 2 of those compartments were breached. There were enough lifeboat spaces for everyone on board. The ship was also equipped with radar, which at this point was still a fairly new innovation in civilian travel. As was the case with the commercial air travel industry, radar was something that had older roots, but went through some major developments during World War II.
To the nation of Italy, the Andrea Doria was also not just an ocean liner. It was meant to show the world how Italy was rebuilding itself as a nation after World War II. It was part PR, part aspiration, showing Italy as a place of refinement and elegance, and of course, beautiful and historically important artwork, an example of Italy's place in world culture. During the ship's first test voyages, there was enormous fanfare at its departure and at every port it visited, all of it documented via newsreels that then went out around the world.
After various trial runs and a cruise around the Mediterranean, the Andrea Doria departed on its first transatlantic voyage from Genoa to New York on January 14th, 1953. From there, it took passengers on its one and only Caribbean cruise, which lasted for 2 weeks. After that, it returned to the North Atlantic, and all in all, this ship safely crossed the Atlantic Ocean 100 times before its final voyage.
The other ship in this collision, the Stockholm, was part of the Swedish-American line, and its description is not quite as dramatic. The Stockholm was built in 1948, and at the time, it was the largest passenger ship ever built in Sweden. But by 1956, the Stockholm was the smallest passenger liner providing service across the North Atlantic, with a capacity of 548 passengers. While the Andrea Doria's exterior appearance had similarities to today's ocean cruise ships, the Stockholm's design looked more like a yacht. It was built for comfort more than luxury, and like the Andrea Doria, was outfitted with a radar system. Because its home ports were in Sweden, it also had a reinforced bow to allow it to break through icy water.
On July 17th, 1956, the Andrea Doria departed from Genoa, stopping at Cannes, Naples, and Gibraltar before entering the open ocean for a 9-day crossing. It was under the command of Captain Piero Calamai, who was an experienced nautical officer who had served with the Italian Navy during World War I and World War II. He had been with the Andrea Doria since its very first trial runs.
During this voyage, there were 1,706 people aboard the Andrea Doria, including 563 crew. Although a number of celebrities had sailed on the Andrea Doria before, the most well-known people aboard on this final voyage were Ruth Roman, star of various movies, including Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, and songwriter Mike Stoller, who collaborated with Jerry Lieber on songs like Hound Dog, which was first recorded by Big Mama Thornton in 1952. The best-known version of this song was, of course, recorded by Elvis Presley, and that was in 1956.
Yeah, apparently this Elvis recording happened shortly before they departed on the voyage, and nobody really knew who Elvis was yet. On the morning of July 25th, 1956, the Stockholm left New York bound for Gothenburg, Sweden, and from there to Copenhagen, making its 103rd Atlantic crossing. It was carrying 534 passengers and 208 crew. This was under the command of Captain Henry Gunnar Nordenson, who had been born in Massachusetts to Swedish parents, who returned to Sweden while he was still a child. Like Calamai, he was an experienced captain. He had more than 45 years of experience, including 3 years under charter to the U.S. government during World War II.
Although Nordenson was highly experienced and had a reputation for being very strict, when the collision took place, third mate Johan Ernst Karstens Johansson, known just as Karstens, was the one in command. Karstens was 26, and the night of the collision was his first time alone on the bridge.
A pilot ship had guided the Stockholm out of the harbor in New York until they reached Staten Island, and then the Stockholm headed due east from there.
The Stockholm and the Andrea Doria collided just about 12 hours into the Stockholm's voyage, and we'll get into the details after we pause for a sponsor break.
At the top of the show, I mentioned our previous episode on the Empress of Ireland disaster, which came out in November of 2023. This disaster happened in 1914 after the Empress of Ireland collided with another ship called the Storstad. In that earlier episode, we talked about how the accounts that were given by the captain of the Empress of Ireland and the first mate of the Storstad did not agree with each other. It was just impossible for both their statements to simultaneously be true. A commission of inquiry ultimately found that both officers had made errors and that the Storstad's first mate was negligent because he had not summoned the captain once the ship had entered the fog.
Although the loss of life was far greater in the Empress of Ireland disaster, the collision itself had a lot in common with the collision of the Andrea Doria with the Stockholm. Both collisions happened in the fog, with a more junior officer failing to alert the captain about it. In both cases, one ship sank while the other remained seaworthy and assisted with the rescue effort. And in both collisions, the testimonies of the officers and crews of each of the ships do not agree with each other.
But from there's a key difference. After the Empress of Ireland disaster, a commission of inquiry investigated the disaster. It drew conclusions about what had happened. We mentioned those conclusions earlier. Presiding over this inquiry was John Charles Bigham, Lord Mersey, who also presided over inquiries into the sinkings of the Titanic and the Lusitania. It is definitely possible to question the findings of these inquiries, to criticize things about the inquiries themselves. Over the years, people have. But there were investigations into all of these disasters and formal attempts to determine exactly what happened.
In the case of the sinking of the Andrea Doria, though, those attempts were cut short. We're going to get to why, but that means that what we know about the collision comes from accounts that are not only contradictory, but were also never fully investigated, and there was no official conclusion about what happened. Instead, there are so many papers full of witness statements and data from the ship's course recorders and radar plots and times and headings. Some of these papers come to different conclusions because they were written before all the data was available. But in other cases, people have drawn very different conclusions about the same basic facts.
We are not going to get into the minutia of every single thing that happened on each of these ships before they collided because that would be incredibly tedious to listen to. I found some of it very tedious to read, and it also would not actually make anything clearer. So these are just the key elements of what went wrong.
At 10:35 p.m. on July 25, 1956, the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm were both in the North Atlantic, near the Nantucket lightship headed in opposite directions. Lightships have the same purpose as lighthouses, but are typically placed in areas that are too deep for a lighthouse to be built there, or for some other reason are just not suitable for a lighthouse. The U.S. doesn't officially use lightships anymore, and the Nantucket lightship was the last one in use before being decommissioned in 1985. The Nantucket lightship was stationed on the edge of Nantucket Shoals off the coast of Massachusetts, in an area that was so busy with shipping traffic that it had the nickname Times Square.
The Stockholm was headed almost directly toward the Nantucket lightship. Typically, though, eastbound ships passed about 20 miles south of the lightship. This route put the Stockholm in a travel lane that was designated for westbound ships. Most sources attribute this to the fact that this was faster and more direct than going farther south. But Captain Henry Gunnar Nordenson also gave a statement saying that he thought that heading into this oncoming traffic was safer than having to cross over all of it when the Stockholm turned north toward Sweden.
The Andrea Doria was running about an hour behind schedule, which might be why when it entered a fog bank, it didn't reduce its speed very much, dropping from 23 knots, or roughly 26.5 miles per hour, to 21.8 knots, or about 25 miles per hour. Other precautions were being taken, though. The ship was sounding its fog whistle every 100 seconds, and there was a lookout posted on the bow of the ship who was connected to the bridge by phone. The Andrea Doria had also closed its watertight doors and placed extra crew in the engine rooms as a precaution.
This collision took place in a part of the ocean where warm water from the Gulf Stream meets cold water from the North Atlantic, so fog is really common. The fog can also form suddenly, and sometimes it's pretty patchy. While the Andrea Doria had been traveling through fog for several hours, the seas around the Stockholm had been clear at first. When he left Third Officer Johan Ernst Karstens Johansson, Captain Nordenson had given orders that he be summoned if a fog developed.
At about 10:45 p.m., Captain Piero Calamai of the Andrea Doria saw another ship on the radar. That was the Stockholm, although neither ship knew the identity of the other until after they had collided and heard one another's distress calls. The Stockholm was about 17 nautical miles away. Aboard the Stockholm, Karsten spotted the Andrea Doria on the radar about 8 minutes later. At that point, the ships were about 12 nautical miles apart. Karstens used the radar readings to plot out the course of the other ship on the plotting board and was confused by the fact that he couldn't see the Andrea Doria's lights. Even though they were in an area known for sudden, sometimes patchy fog, it apparently did not occur to him that the Andrea Doria might have been in a fog bank that Karstens couldn't see in the dark, but was obscuring the other ship's navigational lights.
According to Karsten's account, at 11:05 p.m., he did sight the Andrea Doria's red navigation light over the Stockholm's port bow. The red side light signifies the port side of the ship, so Karstens concluded that these two ships were going to pass each other port to port, about a mile apart. He ordered a 22.5-degree turn to the starboard, which he thought would then take the Stockholm farther away from the Andrea Doria and give the other ship more room to pass. As this was happening, the Andrea Doria's lights were once again obscured by the fog.
Meanwhile, aboard the Andrea Doria, Calamai briefly sighted the Stockholm's lights over the Andrea Doria's starboard bow. Based on what he observed, he believed that the two ships were passing starboard to starboard and ordered a slight shift toward port to accommodate. Ships typically pass one another port to port, though, and Calamai didn't try to confirm this deviation with the other ship or plot its course on the radar.
Soon after, both of the ships were enveloped by the fog, and once they were visible to each other again, Karsten realized he was seeing a green light from the Andrea Doria's starboard side, not a red light from its port side. He and Calamai, at about the same time, realized they were on a collision course. Calamai ordered the Andrea Doria to make a hard turn to try to get out of the way, while Karstens ordered the Stockholm's engines into a full reverse to try to slow down. At this point, though, a crash was inevitable. There's nothing either of them could have done to recover. And at 11:11 p.m., the Stockholm's reinforced bow, the one that had been made to break through icy water, crashed into the starboard side of the Andrea Doria, almost at a right angle. When the two ships collided, they had a combined speed of almost 40 knots or 46 miles an hour. Both of them were traveling really faster than was, normally advised for foggy conditions.
The bow of the Stockholm was completely crushed, but in spite of that, the ship was still seaworthy. But the Andrea Doria had a huge hole in the starboard side, and it started to lean toward the starboard as it took on water. After colliding, the ships traveled together for a little over 2.5 nautical miles, but then the Stockholm pivoted and tore out another portion of the Andrea Doria's hull.
As we said earlier, this is an overview of what happened. There are moment-by-moment accounts of everything on both ships, and they go on 4 pages. But Calamai's and Karsten's accounts contradict one another. According to Karstens, for the entire time the two ships were approaching each other, they were port to port. But according to Calamai, they were starboard to starboard. As was the case with the Empress of Ireland disaster, both of these things just could not be true at the same time. And as with the Empress of Ireland disaster, if the two ships had kept to their initial course, they would have passed close by one another, but they would not have collided.
We don't have a good explanation for this contradiction. Obvious possibilities are that one or both of the men was mistaken, or that one or both of them was not telling the truth in their statements. But there are some other possibilities as well. Writing in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings in 1958, John Carroll Carruthers argued that the only possible explanation was that the navigational lights spotted from aboard the Stockholm did not belong to the Andrea Doria, that they belonged to some other ship in this extremely busy part of the Atlantic. But the crews of both ships said there was no other ship in the vicinity, and other researchers have dismissed this argument or even framed it as just absurd.
Another hypothesis has been that Karstens had the Stockholm's radar on the wrong setting, with a range of 5 miles rather than 15, so that when he saw the Andrea Doria, it was already much closer to the Stockholm than he thought that it was. Arguments in favor of this idea include that setting the range on the radar, you just twisted a knob. And it would have been really easy to move it to the wrong setting on a darkened bridge or to change it and then forget to change it back. There is a point in the proceedings of what happened where he did change the range and change it back, according to his statements. Others point out that this incorrect setting would have been obvious to Karstens within moments of it happening, although that to me, the it would have been obvious argument doesn't really seem to take into account that it also should have been obvious that the reason he couldn't see the Andrea Doria's lights was fog.
That's like the kind of thing where it's like the whole thing should have been obvious, ideally, but
Yes,
that's not how things work.
Correct.
That collision caused catastrophic damage to the Andrea Doria, leading to a massive rescue operation. And we're going to talk about that after a sponsor break.
Because the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm collided a little after 11 p.m., a lot of the passengers aboard were asleep, especially families with small children aboard the Andrea Doria who were going to need to get up early the next day to disembark from the ship. Most of the people who were killed aboard the Andrea Doria were in their staterooms and were killed instantly in the collision itself. 5 crew members who were at their stations toward the bow of the Stockholm were also killed in the actual collision. When we say that the front of the ship was smashed in, it's really like a giant just smashed the front of it with a hammer. It is so dramatic.
The impact when the two ships collided was so dramatic that one passenger, Linda Morgan, was thrown from her bed on the Andrea Doria onto the deck of the Stockholm. She broke her arm in the process. She survived, but her stepfather and stepsister who were in the stateroom with her were both killed. Linda's father, Edward P. Morgan, was a journalist who covered the collision on the radio. And during his broadcast, he believed that at the time, Linda had been killed.
Yeah, this is one of the things that people mark as like one of the memorable points of his career, because he gave no indication that anything was going on for him personally while he was doing this reporting. Throughout the Andrea Doria, it was obvious that something very serious had happened. People were thrown off of their feet, thrown out of their beds. An orchestra playing in one of the lounges was thrown from the stage, and that orchestra was perhaps ironically playing the song Arrivederci Roma.
Soon after the collision, the captain of the Andrea Doria issued an order to abandon ship. As we said, there were enough lifeboat spaces for everyone on board, but because the ship was tilted so severely, the ones on the port side could not be lowered down to the water. And it was difficult and dangerous to get people into the starboard lifeboats. The decks were slippery and everything was at an angle, and the ship was continually moving with the sea. It also wasn't safe to load the lifeboats and lower them. The boats had to be lowered first, with passengers being lowered by ropes or climbing down rope ladders. Getting to the lifeboats from the interior of the ship was also difficult. It was dark, and parts of the Andrea Doria's interior were filled with smoke and debris.
The Andrea Doria radioed for help, asking specifically for ships with lifeboats to come to their aid. Ships immediately started arriving. some of them did not have a lot of lifeboats to help. There was a freighter called the Cape Ann that arrived a little more than an hour after the collision, followed by 2 ships from the U.S. Navy. Then there was an ocean liner, the Ile-de-France, which arrived at about 2 a.m. just as the fog cleared, and its lifeboats were a really critical part of the rescue operation. The U.S. Coast Guard helped coordinate these rescue efforts, and there were also 8 Coast Guard cutters that were patrolling the area around the collision and looking for more survivors in the water. Although the Stockholm took on survivors as well, initially it could not move. Its anchors had dropped in the collision, and the equipment used to raise them had been destroyed, so the ship had to be cut free of the anchors.
A little more than 6 hours after the collision, 753 survivors from the Andrea Doria had been taken aboard the Ile-de-France, with 545 aboard the Stockholm and the rest on other rescue ships. Captain Piero Calamai believed the Andrea Doria might be able to stay afloat, and he wanted to wait for tugs to arrive to tow it to shore. And failing that, he seemed to be ready to go down with the ship. But the crew refused to leave without him, and he did leave the ship around 5:30 a.m.
At 10:09 a.m., so only about 11 hours after the collision, as the Stockholm and the rescue vessels were on their way to New York with the survivors, the Andrea Doria sank. Photographer Harry A. Trask took photos of the ship as it was sinking from an airplane that was flying only about 75 feet above the water. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for photography for these images, especially one that shows the Andrea Doria, sort of in the process of sinking in 1957.
51 people died during and after the collision, 46 from the Andrea Doria and 5 from the Stockholm. Almost all of those aboard the Andrea Doria who were killed died as a result of the collision itself. Although fewer people died in this collision than in many of the other shipwrecks we've talked about on the show, this was, of course, still tragic. And we should also note that many of the people who were aboard the Andrea Doria were there because they were immigrating to the U.S., and they also lost essentially everything they had.
Yeah, some of them might have been shipping some stuff separately, but a lot of people, all of their belongings were on the ship with them. The aftermath of this collision led to a series of lawsuits, with the owners of the Andrea Doria suing the owners of the Stockholm and vice versa, each of them claiming the other was negligent. And survivors of the crash also filed their own lawsuits against one or both of the shipping companies. These other lawsuits totaled $85 million in third-party claims.
This was admittedly a complicated situation because it involved an Italian ship, a Swedish ship, and claims that were primarily being filed through American courts. An official inquiry started on September 19, 1956, with testimonies and depositions happening in 3 languages. A trial was scheduled to start on April 1st, 1957, to be carried out under U.S. Admiralty law.
There was a ton of really contradictory and confusing testimony in the preliminary hearings and other court proceedings. But the actual trial never happened because on January 22nd, 1957, the 2 steamship companies dropped their lawsuits against one another. And with the permission of a federal court, they instead established a $6 million fund for the survivors.
This was not even 10% of the amount of the third-party claims that had been filed. But the settlement took place under maritime laws that limited each company's liability to the value of their respective vessels. Post-collision, the Stockholm was valued at $4 million. The Andrea Doria was a total loss, so initially its owners were expected to contribute only $400,000, which was its revenue from that final voyage. That, of course, was not nearly enough to cover the existing claims, so the Italian line ultimately paid $1.8 million.
Of course, without any sort of formal ruling on who was to blame or whether the officers of either ship had been negligent, people drew their own conclusions. My read is there were mistakes made on both sides. Calamai, in particular, faced a lot of criticism and became something of a scapegoat, even though, as I said, it seems like there were errors across the board. While the Andrea Doria had been built to give the world a positive representation of Italy, people obviously still remembered that Italy had been one of the Axis powers during World War II and thus the enemy of the United States. Calamite never commanded another ship, and people described him afterward as a broken man.
In 1956, it probably seemed unimaginable that two ships could collide in a way so similar to the way the Empress of Ireland disaster had played out more than 40 years before. But there have been a number of changes and improvements that should prevent a similar collision from happening again today. This includes more defined shipping lanes, improved radar systems and training on how to use them, and bridge-to-bridge communication from one ship to another, rather than communication being relayed through a separate radio room.
Eventually, the Stockholm was repaired and it returned to sea. It went through a series of name changes and changes in ownership before becoming the MV Astoria, eventually becoming the oldest cruise ship still in operation. It stayed in service all the way until 2020 when the cruise industry shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Both its owner and the company that had been chartering it went bankrupt during the pandemic. And in the fall of 2023, it was announced that this ship would be scrapped. I don't know if it has been yet. As of January, though, it had not been.
But the wreck of the Andrea Doria is still on the floor of the sea, although it has deteriorated significantly from when it first sank. The Italian line made no efforts to recover or salvage the wreck, although efforts to dive down to it started the day after it sank. Photojournalist Peter Gimbel took pictures of the wreck that were published in Life magazine in August of 1956. In 1964, divers recovered most of the statue of Andrea Doria from the ship. They had to saw it off at the ankle because there was no way to remove it from its pedestal. In 1968, the first extensive survey of the wreck was undertaken by Italian filmmaker and diver Bruno Vailati. In 1984, after a salvage expedition helmed by Peter Gimbel, the Andrea Doria's safe was opened on a very hyped-up live TV special with author George Plimpton acting as MC. This turned out to be anticlimactic because the safe only contained some waterlogged US dollars and a few Italian lire.
In 1993, a U.S. district court declared the Andrea Doria abandoned and named John F. Moyer salvor in possession, and that gave him salvage rights over the ship. Moyer had already made numerous dives to the site, including to remove works of art and other objects, some of which are now in museum collections. In news coverage, Moyer has been quoted as saying he hopes that there will someday be a museum dedicated to the Andrea Doria.
The wreck of the Andrea Doria is considered to be a challenging and dangerous dive. It's nicknamed the Mount Everest of diving, and more than 20 people are known to have died trying to dive there. It's about 250 feet or 76 meters underwater, which is well beyond the depth that recreational divers can reach. In addition to the need for specialized equipment and training just to reach that depth, the area is also home to very strong currents, with the current moving in different directions from one layer of the sea to the next. There are also a lot of things to get tangled in, like submerged nets and other fishing gear, and sometimes there are even sharks. Just getting to the site can be a challenge thanks to the weather and tendency for fog to develop. It's generally considered possible only during a brief period in the summer months, and divers can typically only stay at the wreck site for about 20 minutes before needing to ascend.
It's possible that specialized equipment might expand that time, but I kept seeing 20 minutes. So it is, of course, also possible to reach the wreck via a submersible vehicle, and one of the companies to do this was OceanGate in 2016. Argus Expeditions had contracted OceanGate for a 2-day mission aboard its Cyclops 1 to capture 2D and 3D sonar scans of the wreck, as well as video and photographs. They were able to complete only 3 out of a planned 10 dives because of very treacherous seas and thick fog, but this still allowed a more thorough look at the wreck than had been possible before. Of course, OceanGate is more widely known today for the disaster that took place aboard its Cyclops 2, renamed the Titan, which imploded on June 18th, 2023. during an expedition to the Titanic.
On that note,
Yeah.
how do you feel about listener mail?
I have listener mail that is from Claire. Claire wrote and said, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. First, thanks a million for all the diligent care you put into the podcast. I've been enjoying the fruits of your labor for years. I have just finished listening to the spring 2024 Unearthed episode. Toward the end of part 1, there was a mention of the addition of a Guinness archive to the Ancestry catalog to help bridge a gap by the destruction of the Irish National Archive during the Civil War here in Ireland. This is a lovely gesture, but it's a pity that it's now behind a paywall. Luckily, there is a free alternative, which was funded by the Irish government as part of the founding of the state's centenary commemorations and celebrations. A project called Beyond 2022 was undertaken to digitally reconstitute the lost Treasury archives by leveraging a host of archives which have duplicate information across the globe. I was lucky enough to work alongside the multidisciplinary team who created this archive. It is available here. That is at virtualtreasury.ie. Not only can the archive be searched for free, but you can even explore a 3D model of the destroyed Treasury building too. Please spread the word. For pet tax, I've attached photos of my 3.5-year-old Scottish Terrier called, I should have looked up how to say this in Irish. I'm just going to try it, and I apologize if I do it very badly. Sona Shasta. This is Irish for contented happiness. He is basically his name. How sweet. Thanks again for all your work. I never miss an episode. So this was again from Claire. Thank you so much, Claire. I don't remember if this archive was something that I stumbled across while doing research for Unearthed back in 2022. That would have been a logical fit to include if I did. It was for sure not mentioned in the news coverage about Guinness, which was, of course, a lot of it released by Guinness. But yeah, that's really cool. And it makes a lot of sense that a lot of the records that were destroyed there during the Civil War would have also had counterparts in other parts of Ireland and elsewhere. So that is really cool that so much of that has been brought together. Also, man, a Scottish Terrier. Scottish Terriers are so cute to me.
They're so cute.
And this particular one, super duper cute, shown in the last picture, with a blue and yellow tennis ball, tongue out, panting very happily. I'm very sorry if I mangled this dog's name by having not tried to find pronunciations before getting into doing listener mail today. If you'd like to send us a note, we're at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. And you can subscribe to our show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever else you like to get your podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.